Marcus Chen had always believed that mountains provided the best defense against the chaos of the world below, but as he stood on the observation deck of his construction site that foggy October morning, watching the emergency radio crackle with increasingly frantic reports from the valley cities, he began to question whether Pine Ridge's elevation would be enough to keep them safe. The 42-year-old former military engineer had moved to this small mountain town 3 years ago, seeking peace after 2 tours in Afghanistan where he'd built fortifications that had saved countless lives. But the voices streaming through the radio spoke of something far worse than enemy combatants. They spoke of people attacking their own families, of hospitals overrun with patients who refused to stay down even after fatal injuries, of entire neighborhoods going dark as their inhabitants simply vanished into the growing night of madness spreading across the country. Marcus adjusted his hard hat and reached for the radio volume as Sheriff Tom Bradley's voice cut through the static, calling for all department heads to meet at the town hall within the hour, his usually calm demeanor cracking with an edge of panic that made Marcus's military instincts kick into high gear. The construction foreman had been working on the new community center when the first reports began filtering in 3 days ago, dismissed by most locals as urban hysteria or perhaps a terrorist attack that would burn itself out like all the others. But Marcus recognized the patterns from his intelligence training, the systematic breakdown of communication networks, the failure of standard containment protocols, and most tellingly the way the infected areas seemed to spread in perfect circles, radiating outward from population centers, as if whatever was causing this followed rules that no human strategist would employ. As Marcus packed his tools and prepared to head down the mountain to town, his radio crackled again with a transmission that made his blood run cold. Dr. Sarah Martinez, Pine Ridge's only physician, was reporting multiple casualties at the county road entrance where a family of hikers had been found attacking other travelers with their bare hands, displaying impossible strength and seeming immunity to pain that reminded Marcus of the combat stimulants he'd seen enemy fighters use, except these people showed no signs of coherent thought or tactical awareness. The description of their movements, jerky, uncoordinated, yet relentlessly aggressive, painted a picture that Marcus's rational mind wanted to reject, but his survival instincts recognized as something fundamentally different from any human threat he'd encountered in his military career. Racing down the winding mountain road in his pickup truck, Marcus arrived at the town hall to find it packed with Pine Ridge's 837 residents, their faces reflecting the same mixture of disbelief and growing terror that he felt gnawing at his own composure. Sheriff Bradley stood at the front of the room, his weathered face grave as he confirmed what everyone feared: the attacking family had been the Hendersons, longtime residents who had gone hiking in the lower elevations 2 days ago and returned as something that could no longer be called human, their eyes empty of recognition even as they savagely attacked anyone who came near them. Dr. Martinez, her medical coat stained with blood from treating the victims, stood to address the crowd with clinical precision that barely masked her own shock, explaining that the attackers had shown no response to pain, no vital signs that made sense, and bite marks that seemed to carry some form of infection that was spreading among the wounded at an alarming rate. As the meeting erupted into chaos with voices calling for immediate evacuation, Marcus found himself standing, his military training overriding his civilian instincts as he addressed the crowd with the authority of someone who had faced impossible odds before. He proposed what many would later call either madness or genius. Rather than flee into the unknown dangers of the outside world, they would transform Pine Ridge into a fortress, using the town's natural mountain defenses and his engineering expertise to create a stronghold that could withstand whatever was coming up from the valleys below. The room fell silent as Marcus outlined his vision of concentric defensive rings, utilizing the construction equipment and materials already available to create traps and barriers that would channel any attackers into carefully controlled kill zones, while Dr. Martinez worked to understand the nature of their enemy and develop countermeasures. The debate that followed would rage for hours, but it was young Alex Rivera, the 17-year-old electronics prodigy who had been quietly working on his laptop in the corner, who provided the deciding argument when he projected local traffic camera feeds onto the wall, showing the highways below clogged with abandoned vehicles and dark figures moving between them with the same unnatural gait that had characterized the Henderson family. As the townspeople stared at the undeniable evidence that evacuation was no longer an option, Marcus felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders, knowing that the survival of everyone in that room now depended on his ability to turn a peaceful mountain town into something that could hold back the tide of whatever humanity was becoming. The first thing Marcus learned about their enemy was that they were not mindless, merely operating on a different kind of intelligence that prioritized hunger over self-preservation, a discovery he made during his third scouting mission to the town's perimeter when he observed a group of infected individuals systematically testing the chain-link fence around the old Miller farm, pressing against different sections until they found the weakest point near the rusted gate post. Armed with binoculars and accompanied by Sheriff Bradley and 2 volunteers, Marcus had been documenting the behavioral patterns of the creatures that had once been their neighbors, noting how they responded to various stimuli with the methodical precision of a military intelligence officer analyzing enemy tactics. The infected showed remarkable persistence when attracted to sound, following the source even when it led them into obvious dangers like the ravine behind the gas station. But they also demonstrated an unsettling ability to adapt their approach when their initial attempts failed, suggesting that whatever had taken over their minds retained some capacity for problem-solving. Dr. Martinez's makeshift laboratory in the clinic's basement had become the nerve center for understanding their enemy, where she worked around the clock analyzing tissue samples from the Henderson family and studying the progression of the infection in the victims who had survived the initial attacks. Her findings painted a disturbing picture of a pathogen that didn't simply kill its host but rewired their nervous system, suppressing higher brain functions while enhancing physical capabilities and eliminating the body's natural limiters that prevented humans from using their full strength. The infected could run for hours without showing signs of fatigue, their muscles operating at maximum efficiency without regard for the damage this caused to their bodies, and their pain receptors had been completely shut down, making them nearly impossible to stop through conventional means. Most terrifying of all, Dr. Martinez discovered that the infection had a dormancy period of anywhere from 6 to 18 hours, meaning that seemingly healthy individuals could be carrying the pathogen without showing any symptoms until it was too late to contain them. As word of Dr. Martinez's research spread through the town, the community began to fracture along predictable lines, with roughly half the population demanding immediate evacuation while the other half rallied behind Marcus's defensive strategy, creating a tension that threatened to tear apart their chances of survival before the real enemy even arrived. The evacuation faction, led by hardware store owner Bill Patterson, argued that staying in Pine Ridge was suicide, pointing to the traffic camera footage that showed the highways clearing as military forces presumably established safe zones in the major cities, while Marcus's supporters, including most of the town's veterans and skilled workers, insisted that fleeing would only put them at the mercy of whatever chaos awaited in the outside world. The debates grew increasingly heated as resources became scarce and the reality of their situation settled in, with families divided against themselves and neighbors who had lived peacefully together for decades suddenly viewing each other with suspicion and fear. Despite the internal conflict, Marcus pressed forward with his fortification plans, transforming the town's construction sites into weapons factories where ordinary citizens learned to build the implements of their survival. The first successful trap test came when 17-year-old Alex Rivera, working with the town's electrician Jerry Walsh, managed to rig a series of motion sensors to a bank of floodlights and air horns that could be activated remotely, creating a system that would draw the infected away from populated areas and into predetermined kill zones. The test subject, a lone infected individual who had wandered up from the valley, responded exactly as predicted, abandoning its random wandering pattern to charge directly toward the noise and light, falling into the camouflaged pit that Marcus had spent 2 days digging with the help of his construction crew. The success of this first trap gave the townspeople hope, but it also revealed the true scale of the challenge they faced when Alex's surveillance equipment picked up thermal signatures indicating that dozens more infected were making their way up the mountain roads, drawn by some instinct that none of them fully understood. The breakthrough came when Dr. Martinez discovered that the infected had severely impaired night vision, their pupils remaining fixed in a state that optimized them for daylight hunting but left them nearly blind in darkness, while their hearing had been enhanced to an almost supernatural degree that allowed them to detect heartbeats from 50 feet away. This intelligence revolutionized Marcus's defensive strategy, shifting from daytime barriers to nighttime advantages that would allow the defenders to strike from the shadows while using sound to manipulate their enemies' movements. Working with Alex, Marcus began designing acoustic funnels that would channel the infected into specific corridors where they could be dealt with efficiently, while Dr. Martinez developed protocols for moving silently through the town after dark, teaching the residents techniques that would mask their biological signatures from the enhanced senses of their pursuers. As the sun set on their 7th day of preparation, Marcus stood on the town hall steps addressing the assembled citizens, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious, explaining that they had transformed Pine Ridge into something unprecedented in the annals of human survival. The town now boasted 3 concentric rings of defenses, each designed to channel attackers into increasingly narrow kill zones where superior tactics and preparation would overcome raw numbers and mindless aggression. But as Marcus spoke, Alex's early warning system began broadcasting the signal they had all been dreading. A massive thermal signature was approaching from the valley, larger than anything they had seen before, suggesting that the scattered groups of infected they had been tracking were merely the advanced scouts of something far more dangerous that was now climbing the mountain roads toward their carefully prepared fortress. Marcus unveiled his master defense plan at dawn on the 8th day, standing before a detailed scale model of Pine Ridge that he had constructed using materials from the hardware store, complete with miniature buildings, roads, and the 3 concentric defensive rings that would either save them all or become their tomb. The outer ring, positioned along the town's natural boundary where the forest met the first residential streets, consisted of camouflaged pit traps connected by underground tunnels that would allow defenders to move unseen between positions, while a network of carefully placed noise generators would funnel attacking forces into predetermined corridors where they could be dealt with systematically. The middle ring incorporated the town's existing infrastructure, transforming school buses into mobile barriers that could be repositioned as needed, while the inner ring centered on the old mining complex at the town's heart, where the reinforced tunnels would serve as both command center and final refuge if their outer defenses failed. The transformation of Pine Ridge from a peaceful mountain community into a fortress of survival began immediately, with every able-bodied resident assigned to construction crews that worked around the clock to implement Marcus's vision. The town's mechanic, Rosa Valdez, led a team that reinforced the school buses with steel plating and welded ramming spikes to their fronts, creating mobile command posts that could crush through enemy lines while providing cover for retreating defenders. Meanwhile, the local carpenter, James Murphy, supervised the construction of elevated walkways between buildings, allowing defenders to move through the town without touching the ground where they might be detected by the infected's enhanced hearing. Even the children contributed to the effort, with teenagers like Alex Rivera working alongside adults to install the electronic systems that would coordinate their defense, while younger kids helped sort and distribute supplies that had been commandeered from every store and home in town. Dr. Martinez's continued research into the infected's physiology revealed additional weaknesses that Marcus incorporated into his defensive strategy, most notably the discovery that the creatures became disoriented when exposed to rapidly changing light patterns, their rewired nervous systems unable to process the visual information quickly enough to maintain their coordination. This breakthrough led to the development of what Alex dubbed the strobe zones, areas where powerful lights would flash in carefully timed sequences that would essentially blind the infected while allowing defenders wearing specially designed protective eyewear to move freely among their confused enemies. The system required precise timing and coordination, but test runs using captured infected individuals proved that even the most aggressive creatures could be rendered helpless when caught in the overlapping fields of the strobe lights, stumbling around in circles while defenders moved in to eliminate them safely. The town's transformation also required difficult decisions about resource allocation and population management, with Marcus establishing strict protocols for food distribution, ammunition storage, and the assignment of defensive positions based on each resident's skills and physical capabilities. The elderly and infirm would be housed in the deepest parts of the mine complex, along with the children and pregnant women, while the strongest and most capable adults would man the outer defenses where the fighting would be most intense. Dr. Martinez established a triage system that prioritized the treatment of defenders who could return to combat, while also maintaining her research into potential treatments for the infection, though she warned that any cure would likely come too late to help their immediate situation. The first major test of their defenses came on the 10th day when a group of 15 infected individuals, likely the remnants of a hiking party that had been caught in the initial outbreak, approached the outer perimeter during the early morning hours when the town's defenders were at their most vulnerable. Alex's motion sensors detected the approach 20 minutes before visual contact, giving Marcus time to coordinate the response using the communication system they had established throughout the town. The infected moved with the single-minded purpose that had become their trademark, following the sound of the automated noise generators directly into the first trap zone, where they fell into the carefully camouflaged pits that had been dug across the main approach routes, while those who avoided the pits found themselves channeled into the strobe zones where waiting defenders could eliminate them without risk. The successful defense of this first assault proved that Marcus's system could work, but it also revealed critical flaws that needed immediate correction, most notably the discovery that some infected individuals retained enough problem-solving ability to avoid the most obvious traps, requiring the defenders to develop more sophisticated deception techniques. Moreover, the cleanup after the attack revealed that the infected carried with them personal effects and identification that confirmed Dr. Martinez's worst fears about the scope of the outbreak, with driver's licenses and credit cards from cities hundreds of miles away, suggesting that the infection had spread far beyond the initial reports and that the thermal signature approaching from the valley represented only a fraction of the infected population that might eventually reach Pine Ridge. As Marcus stood in the town square that evening, surrounded by the evidence of their successful defense but haunted by the implications of what they had learned, he addressed the assembled defenders with a mixture of pride and grim determination, explaining that they had proven their ability to survive but that the real test was still approaching from the darkness beyond their mountain sanctuary. The massive thermal signature that Alex's equipment had detected was now less than 12 hours away, and satellite imagery suggested that it represented not just a larger group of infected individuals but something that moved with a coordination and purpose that defied everything they thought they knew about their enemy, forcing Marcus to confront the possibility that their carefully prepared defenses might be facing an intelligence that could adapt and counter their strategies with the same ruthless efficiency that had allowed it to survive and spread across the continent. The massive horde arrived at Pine Ridge's outer perimeter at 3:47 a.m. on the 13th day, their approach detected by Alex Rivera's thermal imaging system a full hour before the first infected individual stepped into the range of the town's floodlights, giving Marcus precious time to coordinate what would become the most crucial test of their defensive strategy. From his command post in the reinforced bell tower of the old church, Marcus watched through night vision binoculars as nearly 200 infected individuals moved up the mountain road with an unsettling coordination that defied everything Dr. Martinez had discovered about their individual behavior patterns, suggesting that something was directing their movements with an intelligence that transformed them from a collection of mindless predators into something resembling a military formation. The infected moved in loose clusters that maintained visual contact with each other, responding to subtle changes in direction and pace that indicated a level of communication that should have been impossible given their neurological damage, forcing Marcus to abandon his carefully planned defensive sequence and adapt his strategy in real time. The outer ring of traps performed exactly as designed, channeling the approaching horde into the predetermined corridors where the first wave of infected fell into the camouflaged pits that had been dug across the main approach routes, but Marcus quickly realized that the creatures were learning from each failure, with subsequent groups avoiding the areas where their predecessors had disappeared and finding alternate routes that threatened to overwhelm the defenders' carefully planned positions. Sheriff Bradley, commanding the outer perimeter from his position behind the reinforced barricades, reported that the infected were displaying tactical awareness that exceeded their previous encounters, with some individuals actually retreating from obvious trap locations and circling around to attack from unexpected directions, while others seemed to be deliberately triggering the noise generators to mask the movement of their companions through areas that should have been under constant surveillance. Dr. Martinez, monitoring the battle from her medical station in the town hall basement, found herself treating the first casualties of their prolonged defense, including 2 defenders who had been overwhelmed when a group of infected managed to breach the outer perimeter through a drainage culvert that had been overlooked in the initial planning. The injuries she documented revealed new aspects of the infection's progression, with bite victims showing signs of neurological changes within minutes of exposure, their pupils dilating and their speech patterns becoming increasingly erratic as the pathogen began its assault on their higher brain functions. Working with limited supplies and under constant pressure, Dr. Martinez made the difficult decision to isolate the infected defenders in a sealed section of the mine complex, knowing that her research into potential treatments would have to wait until the immediate threat had been neutralized. The middle ring of defenses, centered on the mobile barriers and elevated walkways that connected the town's buildings, became the scene of the most intense fighting as the infected who had survived the outer traps pressed their assault with relentless determination, their enhanced physical capabilities allowing them to climb over obstacles that should have been impassable while their lack of pain sensitivity meant that even severe injuries failed to slow their advance. Rosa Valdez, commanding one of the armored school buses, reported that the infected were actually working together to overcome her mobile barriers, with some individuals creating human pyramids that allowed others to reach the elevated walkways where they could attack the defenders from unexpected angles, while others seemed to be coordinating their assaults to draw defenders away from critical positions that could then be overrun by follow-up attacks. The breakthrough moment came when Alex Rivera, analyzing the battle through his network of surveillance cameras, noticed that the infected were responding to subtle hand signals from a single individual who remained at the edge of the combat zone, never directly engaging but apparently coordinating the attacks with a level of strategic thinking that shocked everyone who witnessed it. This discovery forced Marcus to confront the terrifying possibility that the infection had not simply created mindless killing machines but had somehow preserved or enhanced the tactical intelligence of certain individuals, creating a new kind of enemy that combined the physical advantages of the infected with the strategic thinking of a military commander, fundamentally changing the nature of the threat they faced. The tide of battle turned when Marcus made the desperate decision to activate all of the town's defensive systems simultaneously, creating a coordinated light and sound display that overwhelmed the infected's enhanced senses while allowing the defenders to launch a counterattack that drove the remaining creatures back toward the outer perimeter. The strobe zones that had been installed throughout the town created corridors of confusion where the infected stumbled blindly while defenders moved among them with practiced efficiency, while the acoustic funnels channeled the retreating creatures into kill zones where they could be eliminated without risk to the human defenders. But the cost of this victory was immediately apparent as Marcus surveyed the aftermath of their first major engagement. 7 defenders had been lost in the fighting, including 2 volunteers who had been overwhelmed while manning the outer perimeter, while nearly a dozen others had suffered injuries that would prevent them from participating in future battles, reducing their effective fighting force at a time when they could least afford such losses. More troubling still was the discovery that the infected leader had escaped the battle, retreating with a core group of followers who had managed to avoid the worst of the defensive countermeasures, suggesting that their enemy was capable of learning from defeat and would return with new strategies designed to overcome the defenses that had proven successful during this first siege. As dawn broke over Pine Ridge, revealing the evidence of their hard-won victory scattered across the outer perimeter, Marcus found himself facing the sobering reality that they had survived their first major test but that the real war was only beginning. With an enemy that combined the relentless hunger of the infected with the tactical intelligence of a seasoned military commander who now understood exactly what they were capable of and would undoubtedly return with a plan to counter every advantage they had demonstrated. The infected leader returned on the 18th day with a strategy that demonstrated a chilling understanding of human psychology and defensive tactics, beginning not with a direct assault but with a campaign of psychological warfare that tested the defenders' resolve in ways that Marcus had never anticipated during his military service. The first sign of this new approach came when Alex Rivera's surveillance system detected small groups of infected individuals positioning themselves at the very edge of visual range, just close enough to be seen through binoculars but far enough away to avoid the outer perimeter's trap systems, where they would remain motionless for hours before suddenly disappearing into the forest, creating a constant state of tension that wore down the defenders' mental stamina and forced them to maintain full alert status around the clock. The infected leader had clearly learned from the previous engagement that direct confrontation played to the human strengths, and had adapted its strategy to exploit their weaknesses, chief among them their need for sleep and their tendency to make mistakes when operating under prolonged stress. Dr. Martinez's research into the infection's progression had revealed disturbing new developments that explained the enhanced tactical capabilities they were witnessing, particularly her discovery of what she termed partial infections, individuals who had been exposed to the pathogen but whose immune systems had fought it to a standstill, leaving them with enhanced physical capabilities and reduced emotional responses while retaining most of their cognitive functions and memories. These partially infected individuals, whom Alex had dubbed smart zombies, represented a terrifying evolution of the threat because they could think and plan like humans while possessing the enhanced strength and reduced pain sensitivity of the fully infected, making them perfect scouts and saboteurs who could infiltrate human settlements and gather intelligence about defensive preparations. The implications of this discovery sent shockwaves through the town's leadership, as it meant that their enemy now possessed the ability to conduct reconnaissance and develop counter-strategies with the same sophistication as any human military force. The first direct evidence of the infected leader's learning process came when Marcus discovered that several of his carefully concealed trap systems had been systematically disabled during the night, with pressure plates removed and pit covers reinforced in ways that suggested intimate knowledge of their construction techniques, forcing him to confront the possibility that their enemy had been studying their defensive preparations with the same attention to detail that he had devoted to understanding infected behavior patterns. The sabotage had been carried out with surgical precision, targeting only the most effective traps while leaving obvious decoys untouched, suggesting that the infected leader possessed not only tactical intelligence but also the patience and discipline to conduct long-term operations that would weaken the defender's capabilities over time rather than through direct confrontation. This revelation forced Marcus to completely redesign his defensive strategy, incorporating multiple layers of deception and false information that would confuse enemy reconnaissance while protecting the town's true defensive capabilities. The psychological pressure intensified when the infected began using tools and weapons salvaged from their previous victims, with Alex's cameras capturing images of creatures wielding crowbars and hammers with disturbing proficiency, while others had fashioned crude spears from broken fence posts and kitchen knives, transforming them from mindless predators into something resembling a primitive but effective military force. The sight of infected individuals coordinating their movements while carrying weapons sent waves of terror through the civilian population, many of whom had clung to the hope that their enemies were nothing more than diseased animals that could be contained through superior technology and planning, but now faced the reality that they were fighting against something that retained enough human intelligence to understand and counter their defensive strategies while possessing physical capabilities that far exceeded those of normal humans. The breaking point came when Sheriff Bradley reported that several of the town's defensive positions had been infiltrated by individuals who appeared to be uninfected refugees seeking shelter, but who had revealed themselves to be partially infected scouts gathering intelligence about the town's internal layout and defensive protocols, forcing Marcus to implement harsh security measures that further divided the community between those who supported aggressive screening procedures and those who argued that such measures violated their fundamental humanity. The discovery that their enemy could now pass for human, at least superficially, meant that every stranger who approached Pine Ridge represented a potential threat, while the possibility that some of their own defenders might have been partially infected without showing obvious symptoms created an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that threatened to destroy the community cohesion that had been their greatest strength throughout the crisis. Dr. Martinez's attempts to develop a reliable test for partial infection had so far proven unsuccessful, with the pathogen's effects varying significantly between individuals and the symptoms often overlapping with those of extreme stress and sleep deprivation that were common among all the defenders, making it impossible to distinguish between infected individuals and those who were simply pushed to their physical and mental limits by the prolonged siege. The medical facilities that had been adequate for treating conventional injuries were proving inadequate for the complex neurological and psychological effects of the infection, while the isolation protocols that had been established for handling fully infected individuals were inappropriate for dealing with partially infected people who retained their human personalities and relationships, creating ethical dilemmas that had no clear solutions and further strained the community's ability to present a united front against their enemies. As Marcus stood in the town square on the evening of the 20th day, addressing a population that had been reduced to fewer than 700 individuals through casualties, evacuations, and the growing fear that some among them might already be compromised, he realized that the infected leader had succeeded in transforming their fight for survival into something far more complex and dangerous than a simple battle between humans and monsters. The enemy they now faced possessed not only the physical advantages of the infected but also the strategic intelligence necessary to exploit human weaknesses, creating a situation where traditional military tactics were insufficient and where the very qualities that made them human, their compassion, their trust, and their reluctance to harm those who appeared to be fellow survivors, had become liabilities that could be exploited by an adversary that understood human nature better than they understood themselves, forcing Marcus to confront the possibility that winning this war might require them to sacrifice the very humanity they were fighting to preserve. The infected leader's most devastating attack came not through direct assault but through a coordinated psychological operation that began at dawn on the 23rd day, when the town's communication system started broadcasting voices that the defenders recognized as their missing friends and family members, calling out for help from locations throughout the surrounding forest in a campaign of emotional manipulation that shattered the mental defenses of even the most hardened survivors. Marcus, monitoring the transmissions from his command post, immediately recognized the tactical brilliance of the strategy, as the infected leader had clearly studied the town's personnel records and identified the specific relationships and emotional bonds that could be exploited to draw defenders away from their positions, using the partially infected individuals' retained memories and speech patterns to create convincing pleas for rescue that would be nearly impossible for human beings to ignore. The voices belonged to people who had been lost during the initial outbreak or subsequent attacks, family members who had been evacuated or had attempted to flee, and in some cases, defenders who had been reported missing during recent patrols, all of them now calling out with desperate urgency that cut through the logical understanding that these transmissions represented enemy deception. The first breach of the outer perimeter came when James Murphy, the town's carpenter who had helped build many of the defensive structures, abandoned his position to investigate what he believed was his daughter's voice calling for help from the old logging road, despite explicit orders from Marcus that no one was to leave their assigned posts without authorization. Murphy's absence created a gap in the defensive line that the infected exploited within minutes, with a coordinated group of smart zombies infiltrating the middle defensive ring while the remaining defenders were distracted by the continuing broadcast of familiar voices, demonstrating that the infected leader had developed a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that allowed it to predict and manipulate their emotional responses with devastating effectiveness. The psychological assault intensified when the voices began sharing specific memories and personal details that only the real individuals would have known, including private conversations and intimate family moments that the infected had somehow extracted from their victims, creating a level of authenticity that made it almost impossible for the defenders to distinguish between genuine pleas for help and enemy deception. Dr. Martinez, working frantically in her makeshift laboratory while the defenses crumbled around her, made a breakthrough discovery that explained how the infected leader had acquired such detailed knowledge of the town's population, revealing that the infection preserved and enhanced certain memory functions while destroying others, allowing partially infected individuals to retain detailed recollections of their human lives while losing their emotional connections to those memories, effectively turning them into living databases of intelligence that could be accessed and exploited by the more sophisticated infected leadership. Her research indicated that the infected leader was not just using psychological warfare but was actually harvesting the memories and knowledge of its victims, creating a collective intelligence that grew stronger with each person infected, explaining how it had been able to develop such sophisticated tactics and counter-strategies in such a short period of time. The implications of this discovery were staggering, as it meant that every person lost to the infection was not just a casualty but a source of strategic intelligence that would be used against the remaining survivors, making each loss exponentially more dangerous than simple attrition would suggest. The breaking point came when Alex Rivera's surveillance system detected movement in the old mine complex that served as the town's final refuge, revealing that the infected had somehow infiltrated the tunnel system that was supposed to be impregnable, forcing Marcus to confront the terrifying possibility that their most secure location had been compromised by an enemy that possessed detailed knowledge of its layout and defenses. The discovery that infected individuals were already inside the mine complex, moving through passages that should have been sealed and secured, created panic among the civilian population and forced the defenders to abandon their carefully planned defensive positions to deal with threats that were emerging from areas they had assumed were safe. The infection of the mine complex represented not just a tactical disaster but a complete breakdown of the defensive strategy that had kept them alive for over 3 weeks, forcing Marcus to make the agonizing decision to evacuate the civilians to an alternate location while maintaining a skeleton crew to hold the remaining defensive positions. The evacuation itself became a nightmare of logistical complexity and emotional trauma, as families were separated and essential supplies had to be abandoned while the defenders fought a running battle through the town streets against infected individuals who seemed to know exactly where the civilians were attempting to go, suggesting that the enemy's intelligence network had penetrated even the most secure planning sessions. Rosa Valdez, commanding the armored school bus that was carrying the majority of the children and elderly, reported that the infected were setting up ambushes along the evacuation routes with a level of coordination that indicated real-time communication between different groups, while Sheriff Bradley confirmed that several of the town's most trusted defenders had revealed themselves to be partially infected, turning on their former companions at the moment when their betrayal would cause maximum damage to the evacuation effort. The ultimate betrayal came when Dr. Martinez herself was revealed to have been partially infected for several days, her enhanced cognitive abilities allowing her to hide the symptoms while using her position to gather intelligence about the town's defensive capabilities and evacuation plans, explaining how the infected leader had obtained such detailed knowledge of their strategies and weaknesses, while also calling into question every piece of medical advice and research that had guided their survival efforts throughout the crisis. The discovery that their most trusted scientific advisor had been compromised forced Marcus to question everything he thought he knew about the infection, the enemy's capabilities, and the loyalty of the people around him, creating a crisis of trust that threatened to destroy the remaining cohesion of the survivor community at the moment when unity was most essential for their survival. As Marcus stood in the ruins of what had once been Pine Ridge's Main Street, surrounded by the evidence of his failed defensive strategy and watching the last of the civilian population disappear into the forest with uncertain prospects for survival, he realized that the infected leader had succeeded in destroying not just their physical defenses but the very foundation of human cooperation and trust that had made their resistance possible in the first place. The enemy they faced had evolved beyond simple predation into something that understood human nature well enough to turn their greatest strengths into weaknesses, their compassion into vulnerability, and their bonds of loyalty into instruments of betrayal, forcing Marcus to confront the possibility that the war for Pine Ridge had been lost not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance but through the enemy's ability to corrupt the very humanity that the survivors had been fighting to preserve. Marcus Chen stood at the entrance to the old mine shaft with fewer than 60 defenders at his back, facing the largest coordinated assault that the infected leader had yet mounted, a final push that would either break the last remnants of human resistance in Pine Ridge or provide the opportunity for a desperate gambit that might turn the tide of a war that had already cost them everything they had once called home. The infected approached in organized formations that demonstrated the full extent of their tactical evolution, with smart zombies directing groups of fully infected individuals and coordinated maneuvers that exploited every weakness in the hastily established defensive perimeter, while the infected leader itself remained visible at the edge of the combat zone, its presence a constant reminder that they were facing an intelligence that had learned to think like a human while possessing capabilities that far exceeded normal human limitations. The mine shaft behind Marcus represented both their final refuge and their potential tomb, its narrow entrance creating a choke point that could be defended by a small force but also eliminating any possibility of retreat or evacuation if their defenses failed. Alex Rivera, operating from a communications center that had been hastily established in the mine's depths, managed to restore contact with the outside world for the first time in weeks, discovering that Pine Ridge's struggle was not an isolated incident but part of a global conflict that had seen similar communities around the world either falling to coordinated infected attacks or developing innovative defensive strategies that had allowed them to survive, providing both hope and crucial intelligence about tactics that had proven successful in other locations. The external communications revealed that military forces were beginning to establish safe zones in major population centers, but that rural communities like Pine Ridge were largely on their own, with rescue operations impossible due to the sheer scale of the infected population and the strategic intelligence that the enemy had developed through their memory harvesting capabilities. More importantly, Alex learned that several communities had discovered ways to disrupt the infected's coordination abilities, suggesting that the collective intelligence that made them so dangerous might also represent a vulnerability that could be exploited by defenders with the right knowledge and equipment. The breakthrough came when Marcus realized that Dr. Martinez's betrayal, devastating as it had been, had also provided him with crucial intelligence about the infected leader's capabilities and limitations, particularly the discovery that the partially infected individuals who served as the enemy's intelligence network required regular contact with the leader to maintain their cognitive enhancements, suggesting that severing these connections might reduce their effectiveness significantly. Working with Alex and the remaining technical specialists, Marcus developed a plan to use the mine's old electrical systems to create a powerful electromagnetic pulse that would disrupt the bioelectric signals that the infected used for coordination, potentially reducing the enemy's tactical advantages while giving the defenders an opportunity to eliminate the leader during the confusion that would follow. The plan required precise timing and the sacrifice of most of their remaining electronic equipment, but it represented their only chance to level the playing field against an enemy that had consistently outmaneuvered them through superior intelligence and coordination. The final battle began when Marcus triggered every remaining defensive system simultaneously, creating a coordinated light and sound display that drew the infected into the killing ground that had been prepared at the mine entrance, while Alex activated the electromagnetic pulse that sent waves of disruption through the enemy's communication network, causing the smart zombies to lose their coordination and the fully infected to revert to their basic predatory instincts without the strategic guidance that had made them so dangerous. The effect was immediate and dramatic, with the infected formations breaking apart into individual attackers who could be dealt with using conventional defensive tactics, while the infected leader itself seemed to stagger as its network of partially infected lieutenants lost their cognitive enhancements and became unable to relay intelligence or coordinate attacks across the battlefield. The confrontation between Marcus and the infected leader occurred in the narrow confines of the mine entrance, where the creature that had once been human revealed its tragic origins as a former military officer whose partial infection had preserved its tactical knowledge while stripping away its humanity, creating a being that understood war and strategy but no longer comprehended the values and relationships that gave human conflict meaning. The infected leader spoke in broken phrases that revealed fragments of its former identity, military protocols mixed with predatory instincts, while its enhanced physical capabilities made it a formidable opponent even without the support of its coordinated forces, forcing Marcus to rely on his engineering knowledge and understanding of the mine's layout to gain tactical advantages that compensated for his inferior strength and speed. The unexpected alliance that formed during the final moments of the battle came when several of the smart zombies, their connection to the infected leader severed by the electromagnetic pulse, began to display signs of their former humanity, with some actually turning against the fully infected and assisting the human defenders in ways that suggested their partial infection had left room for choice and moral reasoning under the right circumstances. These partially infected individuals, led by a woman who retained enough of her memories to recognize Marcus from the town's defense meetings, provided crucial assistance in the final assault on the infected leader, their enhanced physical capabilities and intimate knowledge of infected tactics proving decisive in overcoming an enemy that had seemed invincible just hours before. The infected leader's final defeat came not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance but through the realization that its greatest strength, the collective intelligence derived from harvested human memories, had also preserved within it the capacity for human emotion and moral reasoning that could be awakened under the right circumstances, causing it to hesitate at the crucial moment when it might have struck the killing blow against Marcus, allowing the surviving defenders to overwhelm it with a coordinated attack that ended its reign of terror over Pine Ridge. As the infected leader fell, its death seemed to trigger a cascade effect among the remaining infected, with many of them suddenly collapsing as the bioelectric network that had sustained their enhanced capabilities failed, while others reverted to a more primitive state that made them manageable threats rather than the coordinated menace they had represented under the leader's guidance. The victory came at a cost that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives, with only 37 of the original 837 residents of Pine Ridge still alive when the sun rose on the 26th day, but it also represented something unprecedented in the global struggle against the infected, providing proof that the enemy's coordination could be disrupted and that even partially infected individuals retained enough humanity to choose cooperation over predation when given the opportunity, offering hope that the war between humans and infected might eventually be won through understanding rather than simple elimination. 6 months after the final battle at Pine Ridge, Marcus Chin stood on the rebuilt observation deck of what had once been his construction site, surveying a town that bore little resemblance to the peaceful mountain community he had moved to 3 years earlier, but which had become something unprecedented in the post-outbreak world, a functioning example of how humans and the partially infected could coexist in an environment where survival depended on cooperation rather than elimination. The 37 survivors of the siege had grown to nearly 200 residents, including refugees from other communities who had heard about Pine Ridge's unique approach to managing the infected crisis, as well as a carefully screened population of reformed smart zombies who had chosen to integrate into human society rather than succumb to their predatory instincts, creating a hybrid community that challenged every assumption about the nature of the infection and the possibility of recovery. The rebuilding process had been guided by harsh lessons learned during the siege, with Marcus implementing defensive systems that were both more sophisticated and more humane than the original fortifications, incorporating early warning networks that could detect infected approaches while also providing safe corridors for partially infected individuals who sought treatment or integration, and establishing protocols for determining which infected could be safely rehabilitated and which posed insurmountable dangers to the community. Dr. Martinez's research, continued by her former assistants who had survived the betrayal, had revealed that the electromagnetic pulse treatments that had proven so effective during the final battle could also be used therapeutically, helping partially infected individuals regain more of their human cognitive functions while reducing their dependence on the bioelectric networks that had made them vulnerable to manipulation by infected leaders, opening the possibility that the infection might be not just survivable but actually reversible under the right circumstances. Alex Rivera, now serving as the town's communications coordinator and liaison with other survivor communities, had established a network that connected Pine Ridge with settlements across 3 continents, sharing the defensive innovations and integration protocols that had made their survival possible while learning from other communities that had developed their own solutions to the challenges of post-outbreak existence. The global communication network had revealed that Pine Ridge's electromagnetic pulse strategy had been replicated successfully in dozens of other locations, breaking the coordinated infected threats that had previously made organized defense impossible. While the integration protocols for reformed smart zombies had provided hope for families around the world who had lost loved ones to partial infection but retained hope for their eventual recovery. The most significant change in Pine Ridge was the establishment of what residents called the Integration Center, a facility where partially infected individuals underwent carefully monitored rehabilitation that combined electromagnetic therapy with psychological counseling designed to help them reconnect with their human emotions and moral reasoning, while also providing them with productive roles in the community that utilized their enhanced physical capabilities without exploiting their vulnerabilities. The center had achieved a success rate of nearly 70% in helping smart zombies regain sufficient humanity to live peacefully alongside uninfected residents, though the process required constant vigilance and support that tested the community's resources and patience, demonstrating that coexistence was possible but never easy or guaranteed. Marcus often reflected on the transformation of his own understanding during the months of rebuilding, particularly his evolving relationship with Sarah Chin, the reformed smart zombie who had once been Dr. Martinez's research assistant and who had provided crucial assistance during the final battle against the infected leader, and who now served as the bridge between the human and partially infected populations in Pine Ridge, helping newly arrived smart zombies navigate the complex process of reintegration while also ensuring that the human residents understood the ongoing challenges faced by those who bore the permanent marks of their infection. Sarah's presence in the community served as a constant reminder that the lines between human and infected were far more complex than anyone had initially understood, and that survival in the post-outbreak world would require a fundamental redefinition of what it meant to be human. The arrival of the military reconnaissance team on the 6-month anniversary of the final battle brought news that the federal government was finally establishing formal contact with survivor communities, offering resources and support in exchange for sharing the defensive innovations and integration protocols that had made Pine Ridge's success possible, while also providing intelligence about larger infected populations that continued to pose threats to recovery efforts in other regions. The military representatives were particularly interested in the electromagnetic pulse systems and the psychological rehabilitation techniques that had proven effective with smart zombies, suggesting that Pine Ridge's approach might become a model for national recovery efforts. Though Marcus remained cautious about federal involvement given the community's hard-won independence and the delicate balance they had achieved between security and humanitarian concerns. The establishment of Pine Ridge as a regional center for infected rehabilitation and defensive innovation brought new challenges as well as opportunities, with the town's population continuing to grow as word spread about their success in managing the crisis, while also attracting attention from hostile infected groups that viewed the community's integration efforts as a threat to their own survival strategies, requiring constant vigilance and periodic defensive actions that reminded everyone that their victory had been temporary and conditional rather than permanent and absolute. The community had learned to live with the reality that some infected individuals could never be rehabilitated and that some infected leaders continued to pose existential threats that could only be addressed through the defensive systems and military tactics that had saved them during the original siege. As Marcus prepared to address the evening community meeting where residents would discuss the latest proposals for expansion and the challenges of managing their growing population, he reflected on how the peaceful mountain town he had sought as a refuge from the chaos of the world had instead become the center of a new kind of civilization that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature, survival, and the possibility of redemption even in the face of seemingly insurmountable biological and psychological transformation. The Pine Ridge model offered hope that humanity could adapt and evolve in response to existential threats without losing the essential qualities of compassion, cooperation, and moral reasoning that distinguished them from their infected adversaries, though Marcus understood that this hope came with the constant responsibility of vigilance, innovation, and the willingness to make difficult choices about who could be saved and who posed threats too great to be tolerated. The sun setting over the rebuilt town illuminated defensive walls that incorporated both the hard-learned lessons of military engineering and the humanitarian principles that had made their ultimate victory possible, while the lights beginning to flicker on in windows throughout Pine Ridge represented not just the restoration of normal life but the creation of something entirely new, a community where the survivors of humanity's darkest hour had proven that even in the face of an enemy that could harvest their memories, exploit their emotions, and turn their greatest strengths into weaknesses, the human capacity for adaptation, cooperation, and moral growth remained the most powerful force for survival in a world that had been fundamentally and permanently changed by the outbreak that had tested every assumption about what it meant to be human.